Welcome back everyone to this lecture on data types. We've already encountered a variety of data types that we've seen when calling off columns from an existing table. Let's quickly review the main data types in SQL, since when creating a table, we'll have to choose what data type each column should hold. So here are some data types, the main ones that we've already encountered. There's the Boolean data type, which is just true or false. There's character data types, such as car or care, variable car, and text. There's numeric data types like integer and floating point number. And then there's temporal data types, things like date, time, timestamp, and interval, as well as timestamp with time zone. So we have these generalized categories that we're familiar with, and then we actually have data types within those categories. Some other not as common ones are things like UUID, or Universally Unique Identifiers, which is essentially an algorithmically unique code in order to make sure you have a unique identifier for a particular row. Then you also have things like arrays, which store an array of strings, numbers, etc. You can also store things like JSON. There's HStore, which is a key value pair. And then there's special types such as a network address and geometric data. Now, when creating databases and tables, you should carefully consider which data type should be used for the data to be stored. And typically what you should be doing is reviewing the documentation to see the limitations of the data types. And you can check this out at postgresql.org/docs/current/datatype.html. And it reviews all the subsets of the data types that we just mentioned. So we have the general categories, and then we have the particular data types. So to show you an example of what this would look like, let's imagine we want to store a phone number. And we start thinking, should it be stored as a numeric data type, such as a large integer? And if so, maybe what type of numeric? Should we be storing it as just a normal integer, a big integer, etc.? So we decide we have this task of storing a phone number. And we decide, should we store it as numeric? Well, first thing we should do is take a look at the online documentation for options. And if you go to that documentation page, you'll see a table that looks something like this, where you have the name of a specific data type under the general numerical data type categories. And we can see here we have a bunch of different options. We have small integers, which has a storage size of 2 bytes. We have integer, storage size of 4 bytes. Big int or big integer for 8 bytes. We have a general description for these, like small range, typical choice, and then large range. And you'll notice that as you get larger in these possible ranges, then the storage size becomes larger. And for a phone number, notice that if we just chose small int or small range integer, that actually doesn't have enough integers or digits for us to store a typical phone number. And then notice we also have other things like decimal, double precision, etc. These are things that are unlikely to be needed for a phone number. So you might be thinking, well, based on the fact that phone numbers can have extensions or maybe leading zeros, I'll choose something like big int or a large range integer, since it looks like these numbers are large enough for me to store a full phone number. Well, as I mentioned, based on those limitations, you may think it makes sense to store it as big int or big integer data type. But we should really be thinking about what is best for the situation. Remember, we're storing phone numbers, so why bother with numerics at all? We don't perform arithmetic with phone numbers. So it probably makes more sense to just use some sort of text data type, like a variable character data type, because you're not going to be adding phone numbers together or subtracting numbers from a phone number. Once you have a phone number, it's pretty much set. So it probably makes more sense to just store it as a text data type instead of having to even think about the possible range that is allowed for you if you go with a numeric data type. In fact, what I would recommend you do is always search for best practices online. And you'll quickly discover, if you were to just Google search how to store phone number PostgreSQL, that it's usually recommended to store as a text-based data type due to a variety of issues. Things like, and like I mentioned, there's no arithmetic performed on a phone number typically. You're not adding 2 phone numbers together to get a new phone number. And also things to be careful of is, especially when it comes to country codes, that leading zeros could cause issues. When it comes to numerics, 7 and 07 can often be treated the same. However, they're definitely not the same when it comes to a phone number. So if you Google search just best practice phone number PostgreSQL, you would discover that pretty much everybody recommends to store it as a text-based data type or depending on additional libraries being used as an actual phone data type. Now, keep in mind there's no built-in phone number data type for PostgreSQL, but you can install additional libraries specifically designed for that. But for our use case, it probably makes the most sense to just store it as a text data type. And these are the sort of considerations you should be thinking of when building out your own tables and your own databases. Often, just the internet's your friend. Pretty much everyone's already solved these sort of problems already, and there's usually something you can easily Google search for best practices. So, when creating a database and table, also take your time to plan for long-term storage. Remember, you can always remove historical information you've decided you aren't using, but you can't go back in time to add in information. This goes along with what we discussed during the timestamp and extract lectures. You can always just remove historical timestamp information, but you can't go back in time and add in more information. So it's usually easier just to record more information than it is to have to limit yourself for long term. All right, with that being said, the main things to consider here is always do a quick Google search for best practices and definitely refer to the documentation to see your full range of options for data types when it comes to storing your data. Thanks, and I'll see you at the next lecture.